Hello, hello. This is KSK Book Reviews. I am sitting here with Mr. E. Evans Paull with the book Stop the Road. Stories from the trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars. How you doing today?
Hi, good. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I want to thank you for meeting with me, coming out and having a conversation with me about your very nice, well-written book, very detailed book. I enjoyed it. As you can see, I got a bunch of notes and things that I wanted to go over with you. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're very busy, but I'm glad that you came out to spend a little time with me to go over your work. So, the first thing I want to ask you is history on your history. I know you live in Baltimore now. How long have you lived in Baltimore? What's your
I came to Baltimore. I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, and came to Baltimore after grad school. Got a job in the city planning department where I worked for 25 years. And then I went on to work 6 years at a Washington think tank, working on urban redevelopment issues, and then started my own consulting business that I ran for another 8 years before retiring. But it wasn't a real to retirement, as my wife points out to me, because I jumped into writing this book.
Okay. You were a community planner, and my research on community planners, you guys do a lot of, you guys help make a lot of decisions, in the city. And you can let me know. It just seemed like with a community planner, you would know a lot about how cities are ran, how they function in the aspect of whatever planning department that you would have. But even with that, it would kind of spill over into other aspects of how cities are, different components of cities are ran. So.
Well, as a community planner, there is always a tension between what the community wants and what the bigger picture is for the city government, the federal, state, local priorities as determined by the political leaders. And we're always trying to kind of find our way between those, through that tension to make improvements that improve the community as well as the city as a whole, normally from a physical development point of view. Some planners delve into other areas. I worked for a while in healthcare planning also, but mostly from physical development point of view.
Okay. So, what motivated you to write the book?
So, this is an issue, the manner in which a number of highways were stopped back in the mid-1900s, mid to late 1900s. It struck me as a very significant issue from several points of view. The first is that the amazing sort of populist story that 3 highways were altered by the community. 2 were stopped, and the 3rd was moved out of the downtown corridor to an industrial corridor. So for the main routes of these 3 interstate highways, the city went. The activists went 3 for 3, and considering that none of the activists had a resume that would make you stop and say, these are people to contend with. These were all outsiders who kind of miraculously beat the system. The outsiders beat the insiders. So I thought that was an interesting story in and of itself. And the second major issue was the significance of what happened, because the highways that were stopped arguably saved the historic waterfront communities, Federal Hill, Fells Point, and Canton, and the not so historic Inner Harbor East. Had the highways been built, the later redevelopment of those communities would have either not happened or would have been a shadow of what did happen. Highways just don't make very attractive neighbors. And then the third major issue was that the road wars were such a uniquely revealing window into the city's unfair treatment of its African American population, and the prevalence of the use of highways as well as urban renewal for slum clearance and what's sometimes called Negro removal. That's a story that is still playing out today, and I wanted to bring to light exactly what happened in Baltimore.
And some of those tactics that were used to drive people out of certain areas, in this particular case, black people out of Baltimore at that time. The information that you had in the book, very, very detailed. It goes over a lot of different people. It goes over politicians, businessmen in Baltimore. How did you get all of this information, and where did it all come from?
Okay. A lot of it was sort of standard library and newspaper research. I also gained access to the archives of the Society for the Preservation of Federal Hill and Fells Point.
Not to interrupt, so you're saying anyone can go and find this information anywhere. You can do the research, you can all that, you can fact check and so forth.
Yeah, yes. Well, I mean, you have to, get the support of the folks who have these archives. I used the city government archives, and where I think the book departs from a lot of nonfiction that might be similar, it is that I carried out 55 interviews of folks who were involved, and they gave the book a flavor that goes well beyond social science and facts. It adds a huge human interest element to it. And I actually kind of had an aha moment in the middle of writing the book. I started out writing more or less in the city planning style, the way I've written for 45 years, which is a very sort of just facts ma'am kind of approach. But these interviews, a lot of them were going something like this, that I would kind of bore in on some detail that was missing in my facts, and they wouldn't remember those details, but what they did remember were these anecdotes and stories and their reflections on the other people that were involved, and many of whom have passed away, but it gave the whole story a very strong human interest angle. And after the aha moment was that I realized that this could be more than a city planning book, that this could be an important book about people, about amazing people. And then after I kind of realized that human interest rather than city planning is where I wanted to go with this, then that sort of freed me up as a writer to write more in a storytelling style than a city planning, social science style. I think think the result is for my readers to judge, but I can say that I had a whole lot more fun writing as a storyteller than as a city planner.
I can imagine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I did see that some of the stories, just how people felt about certain things, certain aspects during that time period. Yeah, that's big because you can always, like you said, you can go into a library and get like certain facts, but it's another thing to get it right from people that were actually there. Okay. I know we touched on this, but the activism that helped fight off the roads. It was a certain percentage, a very small percentage of black activism at that time, because the black population was small that was more so West, Mid Baltimore and West Baltimore, I believe, and just a combination of different activist groups coming together just to be able to form. What was that like? Did you talk to any of those activists? Like I know you said you had the interviews.
Yeah. Unfortunately, most of the African American activists that were involved had passed away. But I was able to talk to a lot of people who knew them and regarded them as amazing and effective activists and people. And the folks that have bought my book on the African American side are very appreciative of the fact that I've brought to light folks like Mary Rosemond, one of the activists in Rosemont, John Wells, one of the guys who led this amazing movement called the Relocation Action Movement, and won an amazing victory for all folks who were being relocated by the highways. It sort of gets into a technical definition, but he was able to get $5,000 extra over what's called fair market value for everyone's houses that were being bought. And $5,000 doesn't sound like a whole lot today, but that's about $40,000 now. So it was an amazing victory for all displaced families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. That was a great feat, I'm sure. Especially during that time period, it was really a good thing for him to be able to punch through and be able to talk to him, need to talk to him, negotiate, and actually get it done. Now, with regular people, fighting against, the money machine politicians, what were some of the strategic, or how were they, in your opinion, based on the people you talked to and the research you've done, how were they able to overcome it? I know one person said, okay, they just fought and they just won, but what were some of the key things that they did to be able to deliver that?
I would say there were three main strategies that were huge gains, that resulted in huge gains for the activists. The first is just public opinion, putting out constant critiques of everything the highway planners were throwing out there. Questioning everything, questioning the air quality impacts of the highways, questioning the community impacts, calling attention to jobs that were being lost, calling attention to hardship cases with people being relocated. It was a constant barrage of criticism, and the activists got very sophisticated and were able to critique the demand studies, the travel studies, all the models that said we needed all these highways. They got very sophisticated at questioning all of that, and the result was that it undermined the rationale for the highway, and the city and the state were always kind of thrown on their heels. They were always taking one step forward and two steps back because they had to keep responding to all this criticism. There were no shortcuts, but there were a whole lot of detours, and the detours cost them time. So that's the first whole area. The second area would be that they were successfully able to convince the powers to be that the original plan would have been disastrous, and that alternatives that turned out to be far more expensive. That some of those alternatives, might be partially acceptable, but those alternatives turned out to be a lot more expensive, and eventually the city just threw in the towel because they didn't have the money to do the local match. And then the third was the legal strategies. There were 6 lawsuits, 2 of which sort of won. I'd have to go into more detail than you probably want to do, than to explain why I say sort of won. But both the Fells Point segment and the segment through Lincoln Park were hampered by legal issues, but the city was always on the defense in the courts, had to throw enormous amounts of resources into defending their actions, and those legal, all those lawsuits really took a toll.
You're just constantly going back and forth in the court, through the process, and and then you get to a certain point where it doesn't even make sense to even to keep going back and forth. All right. I did. Now you said, when you said kind of, what I know you said, I guess you would have to go really deep into. Is a way you can, I guess, touch on how they kind of.
Okay. Well, the 2 main lawsuits that I characterize as kind of one. One was the lawsuit challenging the highway through Fells Point. Fells Point activists, primarily the Society for the Preservation of Federal Hill and Fells Point, they were able to get Fells Point put on the National Register for Historic Places. And the lawsuit they filed reflected the law that was changed in 1966, which said that if the federal government is building is funding a highway that's going through a historic area, there has to be a consideration of other alternatives. So the lawsuit in Fells Point was never adjudicated to the point that the judge said, no, you can't build it. It was adjudicated to the point that the judge stopped the acquisitions. It was basically a holding action until such point as the main issue could be litigated, meaning, did the city really had it fulfilled its obligations to look at other alternatives, to consider other alternatives. The city never took it to the next step, almost assuredly, because they thought they were going to lose. So that's when the city started looking at alternatives to going through Fells Point, including tunneling under Fells Point. That turned out to be not so forth. So they ended up with a plan to tunnel around Fells Point under the water, just south of Fells Point, and that turned out to be too expensive. The Leakin Park lawsuit on the west side, the sort of win there was that in 1973, the courts held that the city had not met its obligation for public hearings and for considering alternatives. That the environmental impact statement needed to be redone considering all of the alternatives. So that's essentially the same law that was the Highway Act of 1966 that said if you were going through a historic area or a park, you need to look at alternatives. So the city never went back to court to say that, okay, now we held more public hearings and now we have put out a new environmental impact statement that considers all these alternatives. The city never went back to the courts. Again, almost assuredly because they thought they'd lose.
So why?
So when I say sort of, the main issue was never litigated, but there were setbacks in both instances that kind of put the city on its heels and in search of alternatives that turned out to be too expensive.
In a section or chapter 15, page 292, you went into the blow against the empire, dealing with Congressman Fallon. The environmentalists, I guess that's kind of what we were talking about as far as the environmentalists, they won that battle. Can you go a little bit into that?
Yeah, sure. So the battle to bust the trust, I'm probably going to digress significantly here. If I'm going too far off course, let me know. So Baltimore's Congressman Fallon had been a very key figure in the 1956 Highway Act. He was the guy who drafted the bill that created the Highway Trust Fund, which took a series of taxes, including a gas tax and some other taxes, and put them in a fund that could only be used for building interstate highways. Fallon, being the father of that legislation, took on a role of being the protector of that fund. He thought that the highway program needed to be completed before you considered any other uses of that fund. In the late 1960s, a lot of communities started pressing for alternative uses of the highway funds, switching those funds to transit. Because of the obvious, it was the Highway Act of 1956 authorized what's called 90-10 money. The federal government was paying 90%, the local governments were paying 10%. And it was an irresistible formula. So cities were building highways through communities, partly just to get the federal money. It just didn't make sense in urban areas. In urban areas, there should have been consideration of transit in that funding formula, but there wasn't. So finally in 1973, after about 6 years of controversy, Congress did adopt legislation that was called Busting the Highway Trust. And they allowed cities to move highway funds into transit projects. Just down the road in Washington, D.C., they did exactly that. They moved $1 billion into funding Metro, and it was a huge boost for Metro. In Baltimore, unfortunately, our leadership, Mayor Schaefer, and the governors at the time, were still convinced that the highways were needed, and they were not open to switching to funding for transit. It was a golden opportunity that was missed. If the city back in the mid-1970s would have dropped the highways that were later dropped in the 1980s, I-83 through Falls Point and I-70 through Lincoln Park, if the city would have dropped those and switched the funds to transit, we could have had a much earlier version of the Red Line that would have gotten built in the late 1970s. And it would have been a huge difference maker, rather than, for example, for West Baltimore, for Harlem Park, where we now have the highway to nowhere. It's an abomination and a thorn in the side of our leaders now. We would have had a transit line that would have been a real asset to that community, and the community would almost assuredly would not have gone downhill as far as it did after the highway to nowhere was built.
Yeah, and Mr. Paull went over that, in his book as far as the 90-10. And you can correct me if I get this wrong, but the federal government would give the state 90 cents on the dollar, and all the state had to do was put up 10%. So whatever they wanted to get built as far as the highway, that was the breakdown. So with that, a lot of...
Yeah, except that it was the local government that was normally doing the non-federal share.
That's right, okay. Right.
Yeah.
So I did notice, of course, that was the section on the blow against the empire. You go over a lot of military terms. You mention a lot of military strategies, warfare. It was a battle. It was a fight. That's the theme, and of course the trenches of.
Yeah.
So this brings me into the section 11 on chapter. I keep saying section, but chapter 11, page 228, the Canton Blitzkrieg. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I start that chapter citing a quote from the DPW director in the early 1960s, Bernard Werner. Bernard Werner was the chief advocate for just muscling these highways through with a bare minimum of community involvement. And I call the Canton Blitzkrieg sort of the best example of Bernard Werner's strategy. It's not a strategy that I agree with, but it was successful in Canton. They started acquiring properties there right after the condemnation bill went through in 1967. In Canton, unfortunately, there were mostly willing sellers. Folks wanted to get the highway money to move out of what they thought was a declining neighborhood. They wanted to go to Essex, the eastern Baltimore County, Essex, North Point, Dundalk. So it was a path of little resistance because of the willing sellers. So the city came in and cleared that whole swath in about a year and a half. and it was in about a year and a half later that the activists got going in Canton as well as Fells Point, and put up resistance, even though they had lost about 300 houses already, and folks had been relocated. But anyway, yeah, the blitzkrieg refers to taking quick action to roll through a neighborhood and get the highway underway. But they got stopped before they started pouring concrete, luckily. And then 10 years later, when I-83 was dropped, largely because of Fells Point issues, then that land became available, and they built housing and parks and great community assets, the Canton Waterfront Park and so on.
All right. The blitz spread, like I said.
Yeah.
That's I was telling you that, of course, I'm a World War II, I follow a lot, I study a lot in World War II, so I immediately see that from the German, what's it called, Blitz Lightning, or Blitz something like that. I believe it was something like that, when they did that offensive attack. But, so I guess the people that you interviewed, the research you did at that time, they felt that if the highways came, it would have destroyed a lot of the historic parts of their community. It would have destroyed their current community they were in, which was, it was historic, of course, then too. Baltimore was, very old. But I guess what I want to ask is, they felt that the people of that community at that time felt that they were doing a service for not just themselves, but for the future generations. Did you get that from any of the?
I think the folks that were involved in resisting the highways were mostly selfless people, that they were motivated by a different vision of what cities should be. They wanted to protect the neighborhoods, to help the neighborhoods come back as good places to live, and living next to a highway is just bad quality of life.
The noise, the pollution.
There was an interesting thing that happened in the mid-1960s, maybe about 1966, 1967. Prior to that, most of the highway opposition was neighbors coming together to try to protect their neighborhood, their turf. But in the mid to late 1960s, sort of consistent with the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, young people questioning everything that the establishment stood for. There started to be an infusion of sort of left-leaning folks into the anti-highway movement that had nothing to do with protecting their neighborhoods. They were in it because it fit their sense of what is right and wrong, of that communities were being taken advantage of by the economic and political establishment. The disenfranchised were losing out in this battle. So the movement against destruction, which was a citywide coalition, a terrific coalition, but really the first big multiracial coalition in Baltimore, was a collection of all of the neighborhood groups, as well as all of these activists who were more philosophically opposed rather than protecting their neighborhoods. And it benefited enormously from people who had civil rights experience. Their first president had been heavily involved in the Freedom Summer, the voting rights campaign in the South, and there were lots of folks who kind of went back and forth between civil rights, anti-war, just general community activism, and the highway issue.
So in a way, your book could be looked at as a blueprint in some ways of how to defeat large money and politicians from coming in and destroying your current neighborhood. You know what? An example in some way.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, a lot of folks have written that in reviews that I've gotten on Amazon or on Facebook. They love the book because, you know, it's a case where the good guys came together and kind of miraculously won, and yeah, it's those three things that I was talking about. You know, that they had this, you know, just constant onslaught of bad publicity for the highways that just undermined the rationale and turned public opinion against the highways. And they forced the consideration of alternatives that turned out to be too expensive, and they filed, you know, all these lawsuits that just tied the city up. So it was those three things that won.
Okay. Yeah. I think, yeah, between those, you know, with those things and, you know, like you said, different activists come together, everybody working as a team to be able to push out, because technically they should have lost, like most cities lost when they, you know, when big money comes in, politicians come in and so forth. Yeah.
The press plays an interesting role in this. The Baltimore Sun started out as huge highway boosters way back in the 40s and 50s. And then in the 60s, they started recognizing that a lot of the criticisms were legitimate, but they were still, okay, let's solve these problems and get the highways built. But there was one columnist, a guy named James Dilts, that was just relentlessly anti-highway, and he developed relationships with these activists. He also developed relationships with some of the consultants who were who were being paid by the city, but were surreptitiously working with the opposition. And those consultants would give him, there were press leaks all the time, and embarrassing facts that would come out, and then eventually the Sun papers came off the fence and became vehemently anti-highway, and that was huge. A huge part of public opinion.
I guess one of the last ones I want to go over was in chapter 6 here, was Federal Hill, the Inner Harbor, the conquistadors of concrete. Want to go a little bit into that?
Okay, yeah. So The battle over Federal Hill and the Inner Harbor was a little different than most of the other highway battles we're talking about. The community was active and was opposed, but the decisions were kind of being made over their pay grade, if you will. There was a consulting group called the Urban Design Concept Team that was hired by the city and the state in 1967. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that some of the consultants were kind of surreptitiously working with the highway opponents. That was the Urban Design Concept Team. They were headed by a guy named Nathaniel Owens, an architect out of California, a well-known architect. And Owens had very strong opinions and very little allegiance to his overseers. He risked contract cancellation numerous times, but he was the guy who conceptualized what was later built as I-95 at Fort McHenry. That is a substitute for the highway that was going to go through the Inner Harbor and Federal Hill and then cross over to what's now Inner Harbor East on a 14-lane bridge. His entire oversight team, who I call the conquistadors of concrete, his entire oversight team was still wanted the harbor crossing there at the Inner Harbor and Federal Hill. And the manner in which he was able to persuade Mayor D'Alessandro to support Fort McHenry instead, it's just an amazing story. I worked 45 years in the city planning business on both the public side and the private side as a consultant, and I've never been involved in anything that remotely approaches the manner in which Nathaniel Owens and what I call the insurgent planners, the platitudinous planners or the insurgent planners, worked against the interests of their oversight team supporting Fort McHenry versus Federal Hill. And the fact that they won, it's another kind of an amazing table-turning story where the guys that you would not think have the power ended up winning.
Right. It shows that it can happen. You can win with persistence, and desire to enforce certain I'm not going to go over every chapter in the book because I want you all to go out and purchase the book. I don't want to spoil everything that's in the book, but it's different things that I think that you all will want to get out of the book, but you only have to get it if you pick it up and read it. Another chapter that I think that you all will find interesting when you pick up the book is actually one of the first chapters. Right there, the first chapter. When Mr. Paull goes over when he breaks down the years with the 1940s, the 1950s. Actually, that may be the first chapter. I believe it is. Yes. Yeah. When you break that down. Yeah, when you go over the 40s, the 50s, and what was going on, I think that's a really good intro into the book. And then you go into the other chapters with what's going on with the roads, the politicians, with the different fights, the historic battles This is another thing I wanted to mention to you. Oh, you went on with Federal Hill. That was and it was against the Empire. Okay, so that's what it is. Okay, several blows against the Empire. That is what it is. Okay. Alright, yeah. So you all want to get that. You all want to pick up the book for sure. And definitely, I feel like the Canton Blitzkrieg, is another chapter. It breaks down how the Cantonites, how they defeated the politicians and how they defeated the other road wars. So I'm gonna put a link in my at the bottom of the review, so you can it'll be a link for Mr. Paull's website and a link for where you can purchase his book. And I would say, did you have any other things you want to add?
The one thing we didn't talk a lot about it is the environmental justice issues that are very central to the book. We talked a little about the highway to nowhere. The book goes into exactly what happened there, and we mentioned, busting the trust and so on, and what should have happened was that if Schaefer, if William Goddard Schaefer, our mayor, had been open-minded to switching funds from highways to transit, Harlem Park and West Baltimore would not have gone downhill so far. But there are also amazing stories about how the highway was routed around Rosemont, a middle-class African-American neighborhood just west of the highway to nowhere. Sharp Leadenhall is another African-American neighborhood with an amazing history. And they were almost annihilated by two highway plans and one urban renewal plan, but they came back a little bit, at least a little bit, because of the amazing efforts of a community activist named Mildred Moon. So, again, some of the African-American heroes that have not really had their due prior to the book. That I'm very proud to be able to bring to light.
Okay. Yep. So definitely, and I'm sure that their family, and if they were still around, they would definitely appreciate that. Your contributions to their legacy. With putting them in a book, because you have officially immortalized them. If somebody didn't know about them, they know about them now. So
yeah,
that is very good. Yep. So, Mr. Paull, I do appreciate you coming out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.